Emma King never imagined that inheriting her family's 200-year-old farm would turn into a battle for survival. The land, stretching across rolling hills and flanked by dense forest, had been in her family for generations, passed down from one stubborn ancestor to the next. It was a place of history, its very soil soaked in the sweat and labor of those who had come before her, a sanctuary where every inch told a story. Unlike the modern suburban developments that had swallowed the surrounding areas, the farm stood untouched, a relic of the past defiantly resisting time. She had spent years away, building a career in forensic auditing, working in city offices that smelled of paper and coffee, but when her father passed, leaving the farm in her name, she saw no choice but to return. What she hadn't realized at the time was that by claiming her rightful inheritance, she was walking straight into a war. At first, it was nothing more than an inconvenience, a series of letters from the local property association, polite but persistent. They framed their demands as concerns for community integrity and neighborhood development, yet the underlying message was clear: sell. Move on. Make way. Emma had no intention of doing so. The farm wasn't just some asset on a balance sheet, it was the last tangible link to her father, to the childhood she had spent running barefoot through the fields, to the evenings spent on the porch listening to his stories about the land. The association's president, David Holt, had personally visited her within a week of her arrival, flashing a well-practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was an older man, mid-50s, lean and composed, the kind of person who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of manipulation. "I understand your attachment to this place," he had said, standing on her porch as if he already owned it. "But progress waits for no one. A development deal has been in the works for years now, and we're offering a generous price. This land could be something more than just an old farm." Emma had studied him carefully, noticing the way his fingers tapped lightly against the wooden railing, as if testing its sturdiness. She had dealt with men like him before, men who wielded power not through brute force but through paperwork, legal loopholes, and veiled threats. "This land is exactly what it's supposed to be," she had replied. "And it's not for sale." His smile had remained, but something in his gaze had darkened. "It's always easier when people cooperate," he had said, and then, without waiting for a response, he had turned and walked back to his car. After that, the pressure began to build. Letters turned into warnings. Warnings turned into citations for zoning violations she had never heard of before. One morning, she woke up to find a bright red notice nailed to her barn door, claiming that the property was under review due to structural safety concerns. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. The barn had stood for 2 centuries without issue. But now, suddenly, it was a danger? She knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to drown her in bureaucracy, to make life difficult enough that she would fold. She didn't. Then, things escalated. It started with small disturbances, things she could explain away if she tried hard enough. The gate left open when she was certain she had locked it. A faint smell of gasoline near her tool shed, as if someone had spilled it there, and then thought better of whatever they had planned. Her dog, Baron, growling at nothing in the middle of the night, his ears perked, his stance rigid. She convinced herself it was paranoia, the product of too many late nights spent reading through legal documents, trying to find a way to fight back. But paranoia turned into reality when she found the first sign that someone had stepped over the line. It was a cold, misty morning when she noticed something standing near the edge of the woods. At first she thought it was a tree, some trick of the fog distorting the shape, but as she stepped onto the porch, she realized it was a wooden stake, driven into the ground with precision. Hanging from it was a single piece of carved wood, the letters scorched into its surface with a branding iron. This land must be cleared. Emma had stared at it for a long moment, her breath misting in the morning air. It wasn't just a threat. It was a message. And it was personal. She walked towards it slowly, her boots crunching against the frost-bitten grass. Up close, she saw that the wood wasn't ordinary. It was black oak, the kind that only grew near the back edge of her property, in a grove her grandfather had once protected fiercely. Someone had come onto her land, cut the wood themselves, carved it, burned the letters into it, and then planted it where she would be sure to find it. Baron was growling again, his fur bristling. He sensed something before she did. A shift in the air. A presence. She turned her head sharply, scanning the tree line. Was someone still there? Watching? The rational part of her mind told her that if they were smart enough to do this, they were smart enough to be gone before she found it. But another part, the part that had been raised on the stories of this land and the warnings of her father, whispered something else. They never really leave. Emma didn't call the police. She knew how that would go. They would come out, take a statement, tell her that without cameras or witnesses there was nothing they could do. She had seen this playbook before. Instead, she did something else. She walked back to the house, pulled on her work gloves, grabbed a crowbar, and ripped the stake out of the ground with one sharp pull. Then, she carried it back to the porch and threw it into the fire pit. Let them come back and see that. Let them know she wasn't scared. But as the flames consumed the wood, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Because threats like this weren't made unless the people behind them were willing to follow through. And something told her that this wasn't about money anymore. This was about something deeper, something older. And if they wanted a fight, they had just found the one person stubborn enough to give them one. Emma barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that wooden stake, the scorched letters burned into its surface, as if someone had taken the time to make sure their message would last. She told herself that she had done the right thing, burning it, showing them she wasn't afraid, but the truth sat heavy in her stomach. She was afraid. Not in the way that made a person freeze, but in the way that made them sharpen their instincts, tighten their grip on reality, and prepare for what was coming. Because this wasn't over. That much was certain. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, Emma was already up, pacing the front porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold in her hands. Baron sat beside her, ears perked, eyes locked on the tree line where she had found the stake. He had spent the night restless, growling at nothing, his body tense, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. She had considered driving into town, speaking to someone, but who? The police would ask for evidence, and she had none. A wooden stake with a vague message wasn't a crime. It wasn't even a threat, not legally. She could hear the words already. Do you have any enemies, Miss King? Are you sure this isn't just a local prank? Maybe some kids messing around? She knew how this worked. But she also knew it wasn't kids. She decided instead to take action on her own terms. If they wanted her gone, she needed to find out why. Selling the land had never been an option, but now she needed to understand what was making them so desperate. She pulled out her father's old records, the ones he had kept meticulously stored in the study, detailing every deed, every boundary line, every agreement dating back 2 centuries. Flipping through the pages, she traced her fingers over the documents, searching for anything that stood out. Most of it was exactly what she expected: ownership papers, tax receipts, legal documentation proving that the land had belonged to the King family since before the town itself had existed. But then she found something unusual. A letter. It was folded neatly between the pages of an old survey report from the 1950s, yellowed with time but still legible. The handwriting was precise, almost rigid, like someone had taken great care in choosing their words. Mr. King, the first understand your reluctance, but I must insist that you reconsider our offer. This land holds more than just sentimental value. And those who understand its true worth will not stop until it is properly reclaimed. The structures you believe are permanent are merely placeholders. The land itself does not belong to you, it belongs to something older, something that should not have been disturbed. Please, for your own sake, do not let your stubbornness put you at risk. This is the final time I will ask. Do what is right. There was no signature, no company name, nothing to indicate who had written it. Just an address, one that no longer existed on any map. Emma sat back, heart hammering in her chest, fingers gripping the fragile paper. Something about this letter felt wrong. It wasn't a normal offer, not the kind that land developers sent. It sounded more like a warning her father had ignored. Before she could process it further, the sound of tires crunching against gravel pulled her attention outside. A black SUV rolled up the driveway, sleek and expensive, the kind of car that didn't belong on a dirt road leading to an old farmhouse. Emma set the letter aside and stepped onto the porch just as David Holt climbed out, adjusting the cuff of his pristine white shirt. "Good morning, Miss King," he greeted smoothly, as if they were old friends. Emma crossed her arms. "You must really enjoy making unannounced visits." Holt chuckled, unfazed. "I like to think of it as being proactive. We haven't heard from you, and we were hoping you'd finally come around to reason." "Reason," she repeated, arching a brow. "You mean giving up my land because you and your friends keep sending me threatening letters?" Holt's smile didn't waver, but his eyes sharpened. "Threats? That's a strong word. We're simply offering you a way out before this becomes more complicated." Emma clenched her jaw, every instinct in her telling her not to let him see how much he was getting under her skin. "It's already complicated, Holt. Someone left a stake on my property last night, burned a message into it. Sound familiar?" For the briefest moment, his expression flickered, just enough for Emma to catch it before he smoothed it over. "That's unfortunate," he said, voice carefully measured. "But you can't honestly believe I had something to do with that. I'm a businessman, Miss King, not some backwoods thug." "Then, why are you here?" "Because you're running out of time." Emma narrowed her eyes. "That sounds like a threat." Holt sighed, rubbing his temple like she was exhausting him. "Let's drop the pretense. You know as well as I do that certain things are already in motion. We filed for an eminent domain review. If it goes through, you won't have a choice. The state will take the land. And you'll walk away with nothing. I'm offering you an alternative, a deal while you still have leverage. You can fight this, but we both know how these things end." The words struck like a slap. Emma had known they were playing dirty, but this was something else entirely. Eminent domain. It was the nuclear option, a legal maneuver that allowed the government to seize private land if they could argue that it was for public use. But for that to happen, they needed justification evidence that the land was necessary for infrastructure, preservation, or development. And the fact that they were trying to push it through so quickly meant that whatever they wanted it now. She took a slow breath, refusing to let him see how much this rattled her. "You're bluffing." Holt smiled, pulling a folded document from his pocket and holding it out. "See for yourself." Emma didn't take it. "Get off my land, Holt." He exhaled, tucking the paper back into his jacket. "Have it your way. Just remember I gave you a chance to walk away on your own terms." He turned, walking back to his car with the same casual arrogance as always, but before getting in, he paused and looked over his shoulder. "One last thing," he said. "You might want to check the old well behind the barn. I hear the water's not so clean these days." Then he was gone, tires kicking up dust as he drove back down the road. Emma stood frozen, blood turning to ice. The well. She spun on her heel and ran. The well had been on the property since the beginning, built by her great-great-grandfather, abandoned years ago when they had switched to modern plumbing. But it was still there, covered by a rusted grate. When she reached it, she could already smell it something rotten, something foul. Her stomach clenched as she lifted the grate and peered inside. At the bottom, floating in the dark water, was a pile of dead animals. The message couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was a warning. And it was only going to get worse. Emma forced herself to breathe through her mouth as the stench from the well clawed at her throat. Thick and putrid, a rancid mixture of decay and stagnant water. The sight of the bloated carcasses, rabbits, birds, even a dog floating in the dark, oily depths turned her stomach, but she refused to look away. This wasn't just cruelty. It was calculated, a deliberate move meant to send a message. She backed away, fingers gripping the cold edge of the well as the nausea rose, her pulse hammering in her ears. Someone had climbed down there, had physically dumped those bodies, one by one. The precision of it, the way it was meant to fester unseen until she found it, made her skin crawl. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. It wasn't kids playing a prank. This was a declaration of war. Baron growled low beside her, hackles raised, his teeth bared toward the tree line, and for a second she thought she saw something move between the trunks. A flicker of movement, a shape just outside her vision, gone before she could focus. She turned fully, hand instinctively reaching for the knife she had tucked into her waistband earlier, but the woods remained still, silent, except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. She knew better than to assume she was alone. Every fiber of her being told her she was being watched. With steady hands, she pulled her phone from her pocket and snapped a picture of the well's contents before dialing the sheriff's office. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. Sheriff's Department, a bored male voice, someone young, someone who didn't give a damn. This is Emma King. The first need an officer out at my property immediately. A pause. What's the nature of the emergency? Someone contaminated my well. Another pause, longer this time. Contaminated how? Emma closed her eyes, forcing her voice to remain even. With a pile of dead animals. The voice on the other end exhaled, irritated. "Ma'am, is this some kind of property dispute?" She gritted her teeth. "This is a criminal act. I need someone here now." Silence. Then, "We'll send someone when we can." The line went dead. Emma lowered the phone slowly, resisting the urge to throw it. She had expected them to drag their feet, but the sheer indifference in that officer's voice confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Whoever was behind this had pull. Enough to ensure that law enforcement treated her as nothing more than a nuisance. Enough to make sure she had no official support. She took another breath, steadying herself. If no one was coming to help, she would handle this herself. She needed to get the water tested, needed documented proof of contamination before anyone could claim she was making baseless accusations. She would find out exactly what was in that well and use it to build a case. There had to be someone in town who wasn't in Holt's pocket, someone with the right connections to push back. But first, she had to make sure she wasn't walking into something worse. She circled the house, checking the doors, the windows, the barn. Everything seemed untouched, but that meant nothing. She retrieved a shotgun from the cabinet in the mudroom, loaded it, and set it within reach. Then she grabbed a flashlight and stepped off the porch, following the perimeter of the property toward the tree line. She moved carefully, deliberately, her boots soundless against the damp earth. The woods had always been a place of comfort, a sanctuary from the outside world, but now it felt different. The air was heavier, the silence unnatural. She stopped near the old fence line, listening, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Then she saw it. A single boot print in the mud. Deep, fresh. Someone had been here. Recently. She crouched down, running her fingers lightly over the impression. Whoever left it was heavier than her, probably male. The sole was ridged, work boots, not sneakers. She could see a partial tread pattern distinctive. If she found the right match, she might know exactly who had been sneaking onto her land. A sharp snap echoed through the trees. Emma whipped her head up, pulse spiking, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. She rose slowly, backing toward the house, not daring to turn her back completely on the woods. She had her confirmation. Someone had been watching her. They were probably still watching. She locked the doors behind her, her mind already racing through her next steps. First, she called the only person she could still trust, Dan Walker, the closest thing she had to an ally in this town. He picked up on the second ring. "You all right?" No greeting, just concern. "No," she admitted. "I need your help." She told him everything, the well, the boot print, the feeling of being watched. Dan was silent for a moment. Then, "I'll be there in an hour." True to his word, he pulled up just as dusk settled over the fields, his old pickup rattling to a stop in front of the porch. He was ex-military, had a way of carrying himself that made it clear he didn't spook easily, but as she walked him through the situation, even he looked unsettled. "This isn't just harassment," he said finally. "This is controlled escalation." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" Dan exhaled, looking out over the land. They started small legal pressure, intimidation. When that didn't work, they pushed further. Now they're trying to make you feel unsafe in your own home, make you doubt yourself. They want to break you down before they make their final move. She swallowed. "Which is?" He turned to her, eyes serious. "They're going to force you out, one way or another." The words settled like a stone in her chest. She had always known this wasn't just about money, but now for the first time she understood just how far they were willing to go. Dan crossed his arms. You need to be ready. Lock down this place. Get cameras, alarms. Stay armed at all times. Emma nodded. And the well. I've got a guy who can test it. If there's anything in that water besides decay, we'll know. Relief flooded her. It wasn't much, but it was something. She walked into his truck, and as he climbed in, he hesitated. Emma, she met his gaze. If you see anyone near your house, don't try to scare them off. Don't fire warning shots. If they're here, it's because they've already decided the risk is worth it. She understood what he was saying. If it came to it, she couldn't afford hesitation. That night, she moved a chair to the front window and sat with the shotgun across her lap, watching the tree line, waiting, listening. And as the hours stretched on, she swore she could hear it. A faint creak of footsteps just beyond the darkness. The sound of someone waiting, just as she was. They weren't done yet. And neither was she. Emma barely remembered falling asleep. The exhaustion of the past few days had finally caught up with her, and at some point during the long night, with the shotgun still resting across her lap, her body had given in. But something woke her, a sound, distant but distinct. A metallic clang followed by a dull thud. Her mind snapped to attention before her body fully caught up, adrenaline spiking through her veins as she gripped the gun tighter, listening. Silence. The kind that didn't feel natural. The kind that sat heavy in the air, pressing down like a held breath. Barron was already at the door, his body stiff, his ears perked toward the barn. He let out a low growl, barely audible, but filled with tension. Emma moved carefully, her muscles sore from sleeping upright, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor as she approached the window. She peered out, eyes adjusting to the darkness, searching for movement. The barn doors were slightly open. They hadn't been like that last night. She exhaled slowly, gripping the shotgun tighter. If someone was out there, they were either stupid, desperate, or confident enough to think she wouldn't fight back. She moved toward the back door, unlocked it with practiced ease, and slipped outside. The night was cold against her skin, the damp earth soft beneath her feet. She kept to the shadows, using the trees for cover as she crept toward the barn. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open further, the darkness inside thick and impenetrable. She took a slow step forward, then another. The scent hit her first metallic, raw wrong. Her fingers found the light switch, and as the overhead bulb flickered to life, she felt her stomach drop. The barn was empty except for a single, fresh carcass hanging from the ceiling. A deer, its throat slashed open, blood still pooling beneath it, staining the old wooden planks. But that wasn't what made her breath catch in her throat. It was the way the blood had been smeared across the walls, forming crude, deliberate letters. Leave. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her grip tightening around the shotgun until her knuckles ached. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was personal. This was a message meant for her and only her. Then she heard it, a whisper of movement behind her. She spun just in time to see a figure retreating into the darkness. She raised the shotgun, heart pounding, but the figure was already gone, swallowed by the trees, vanishing into the night like a shadow. She didn't fire. Not yet. Not without knowing exactly where they were. Shooting blindly would do nothing but reveal her position. Instead, she stepped out of the barn, scanning the tree line, her breathing slow and measured. Nothing. They were gone. For now. She backed toward the house, keeping the shotgun raised, her muscles tense and ready. She didn't stop until the door was locked behind her, until Barron was at her side again, his tail stiff, his gaze still fixed on the window. He knew it too. They weren't finished with her yet. The next morning, Dan arrived just as the sun was creeping over the hills, his face tight with concern as he stepped onto the porch. "Tell me everything," he said without preamble. She didn't hold anything back. The well. The boot print. The barn. The figure in the trees. She watched his expression shift as she spoke, his jaw tightening, his shoulders tensing. When she was finished, he let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "They're escalating too fast," he muttered. "They're getting impatient." Emma crossed her arms. Why? If they're so convinced they can take this land legally, why push this hard? Dan hesitated. "Because I don't think they can. Not the way they originally planned." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, setting it on the table between them. "I had my guy look into the eminent domain claim. Something's off. The paperwork was filed, sure, but it's shaky. The justification is thin. They're pushing for a historical reclassification, but that would take months, maybe years. They don't have that kind of time." Emma's stomach tightened. Then why act like they do? Dan met her gaze, his expression grim. "Because they know something we don't, and whatever it is, they can't afford to wait for the legal system to work in their favor." She exhaled, trying to process what that meant. If they were running out of time, if they were this desperate, then it meant she had leverage. It also meant they were far more dangerous than she had originally thought. She glanced toward the tree line, where the figure had disappeared the night before. How far were they willing to go? She didn't have to wait long for an answer. That night, as she sat by the window, shotgun within reach, the first flames licked at the edge of the barn. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the moon cast shadows across the field. But then Baron barked, loud and sharp, and she saw it, the unmistakable glow of fire, flickering against the wood, growing brighter, hungrier. She was on her feet in seconds, grabbing the shotgun as she tore through the door, sprinting across the field. The heat hit her before she even reached the barn, the smoke thick and acrid, burning her throat. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the hose from the side of the house, aiming the stream of water at the flames, but it was useless. The fire was too strong, too fast. It had been set deliberately. Someone had soaked the wood in accelerant. Someone had planned this. The barn was lost. But as she stumbled back, coughing, wiping soot from her eyes, she saw something through the haze of smoke. A silhouette standing at the edge of the property, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. Watching. They wanted her to see this. They wanted her to know. Dan's truck roared down the driveway minutes later, tires skidding against the gravel. He jumped out before it had even fully stopped, eyes wide as he took in the burning barn. "Jesus Christ, Emma. They did this on purpose," she said, her voice raw. "They wanted me to see it." Dan swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "We need to hit back. Now." She looked at him, the fire reflecting in her eyes. "How?" He hesitated, then said, "You said your father kept records, right? Old ones." She nodded. "Then we start there. We figure out what the hell they're really after. And we use it against them." The barn collapsed behind them, embers floating into the sky like dying stars. Emma didn't look back. She was done waiting for them to make the next move. Now it was her turn. Emma had barely left the ruins of her barn since dawn, standing amidst the smoldering wreckage as the first light stretched across the horizon. The destruction felt surreal, as if her mind refused to fully register what had happened. Just hours ago, this place had been whole. It had been hers. Now it was nothing more than a pile of charred wood, the blackened beams twisted and broken, the roof collapsed inward, smoke still rising and thin, ghostly tendrils from the remaining embers. The air smelled of burned hay, melted plastic, and something deeper, something foul and chemical, the unmistakable stench of an accelerant. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had done this with precision, knowing exactly how to make sure the fire spread fast enough that no amount of effort on her part could save it. Baron had been restless all morning, pacing along the property line, ears flicking at every noise beyond the trees. He could feel it too, that something had shifted overnight, that they had reached a point of no return. She had spent the night watching the fire burn, shotgun in hand, her grip so tight her knuckles had ached, waiting for someone to show themselves, for a sign of movement from the shadows beyond the tree line. But no one had come forward, because they didn't need to. The message had already been sent loud and clear. She heard the low rumble of an approaching engine long before Dan's truck appeared in the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires as he pulled up beside the house. He climbed out, taking in the damage with a long, measured silence before finally looking at her. His expression was grim, unreadable, the tension in his posture telling her he had already been expecting something like this. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with something that almost sounded like frustration. She shook her head, still staring at the wreckage. "No, not physically." Dan let out a slow breath, stepping forward, scanning the remains of the barn with an assessing eye. "Jesus," he muttered. "They didn't waste any time." "They're done pretending," Emma said, voice flat, devoid of emotion. Dan was quiet for a long moment before nodding. "Then so are we." They moved inside, spreading out the documents she had been combing through the night before, old maps and faded deeds covering the heavy wooden desk her father had once used. The more they pieced together, the more it became obvious that this wasn't just about property value. Her family's land had been contested for decades, targeted by multiple entities that had since disappeared, their names wiped from existence, leaving only vague traces of their involvement. But what stood out the most was the strange gap in ownership records somewhere along the way. Her family had supposedly signed over half the land to the state. "Your dad ever mentioned losing property?" Dan asked, tapping the edge of a document with one finger. Emma frowned, shaking her head. "Never. He would have fought like hell before giving up a single acre." Dan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then either someone forged this, or someone convinced him to sign something without knowing what it really meant. Emma stared down at the paperwork, the edges of the old pages curling slightly from age. "If they already took half, why are they still coming after me?" Dan's jaw tightened. "Because they never meant to stop at half." The sudden sound of a vehicle approaching broke the silence, and both of them moved in unison. Dan pushed aside the curtain just enough to get a look outside, and Emma followed his gaze. A sleek black SUV had stopped just beyond the front gate, its engine still running. "Stay inside," Dan muttered, reaching for the holster at his hip. Emma didn't listen. She grabbed her shotgun, stepping out onto the porch just as the driver's side door opened. A man climbed out, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit, his movements deliberate, controlled. He didn't belong here. "Miss King," he greeted, his voice smooth, polished, as if they were about to negotiate a business deal. Emma tightened her grip on the shotgun. "Who the hell are you?" The man smiled, unfazed. "Call me Andrew. I work with Mr. Holt." Of course he did. "If you're here to offer me money, don't waste your time." Andrew chuckled. "Oh, I think we're past that stage, don't you?" His gaze flickered briefly toward the barn, the remains of it still smoking in the distance. "This unfortunate accident tells me you're still resisting." Dan took a slow step forward. "You calling arson an accident?" Andrew didn't even acknowledge him, keeping his attention on Emma. "I came to offer you a way out." Emma didn't blink. "I'm listening. You leave. Tonight. Walk away from this land, no questions asked. We'll handle everything, no legal battles, no further complications." His smile widened. "You disappear and this all goes away." Emma held his gaze. "And if I don't?" Andrew tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Then I can't guarantee your safety." Dan let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "That a threat?" Andrew's smile never faltered. "Not at all. Just a reality check. We all want what's best for everyone. No one wants unnecessary escalation." Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain still. He was lying. He didn't want what was best for everyone. He wanted her gone because whoever was pulling the strings was running out of time, and she was standing in their way. She shifted her grip on the shotgun. "Get off my land." Andrew studied her for a moment longer before finally giving a slow nod. "As you wish." He climbed back into the SUV, backed out of the driveway, and disappeared down the road. Dan muttered a curse. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore." Emma exhaled, steadying her pulse. Then, neither are we. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching, waiting, her shotgun across her lap. Barron lay at her feet, ears twitching at every sound, sensing her tension. And just past 3 in the morning she saw it. headlights creeping up the driveway. Another black SUV. Not Andrew's. A different one. It stopped just short of the house. The engine cut off. No one got out. They were watching. Waiting. Testing her. Emma didn't move. She sat in the darkness, her breath slow, controlled, finger resting lightly on the trigger. Minutes passed. Then the SUV slowly reversed, backing away down the road, disappearing into the night like a shadow. She didn't let herself relax, because she knew exactly what this was. They weren't just threatening her anymore. They were stalking her, and they were waiting for her to break. She wasn't going to. She was going to make damn sure of that. Emma had spent the past 2 nights waiting, barely sleeping, barely moving, her shotgun resting across her lap as she sat near the window, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. They had been watching her, circling like wolves just beyond the tree line, testing her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The SUV had returned twice since the first time, crawling up the driveway just far enough to let her know they were there before backing away, retreating into the shadows like a predator toying with its prey. They were trying to make her crack, to make her feel hunted, but all it did was set her resolve deeper into stone. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't leaving. If they wanted her gone, they would have to face her head-on. Dan had insisted on staying, refusing to let her handle this alone. He had been coming and going throughout the day, making arrangements, making sure everything was ready for what they both knew was inevitable. They weren't waiting for the next move anymore. They were preparing for it. The night was colder than the last, the wind sharper, cutting through the trees like a blade. The house was silent except for the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, marking each passing second with an unbearable weight. Emma sat at the kitchen table, staring down at the paperwork spread out in front of her land records, old maps, the documents proving that half her family's property had been taken under suspicious circumstances decades ago. It all pointed to something bigger than just a land dispute, something Holt and his people were trying to bury before she could put the pieces together. Dan stood by the front door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "They're coming tonight." Emma didn't look up. I know he exhaled through his nose, shifting his weight slightly. "They're done with warnings. You saw it in Andrew's face. This is going to get bad." She finally met his gaze. "Then let's make sure it gets bad for them too." Dan studied her for a moment before nodding. "I moved the truck behind the shed. If we need to get out, we have a way." Emma gave a small, humorless smile. "You planning on running?" Dan shook his head. "I'm planning on options." She appreciated that about him. He wasn't reckless, but he also wasn't afraid to stand his ground. He understood that sometimes survival wasn't about making the bravest choice, it was about making the smartest one. The distant rumble of an engine shattered the quiet. Emma stiffened, her fingers tightening around the shotgun. Barron let out a low growl from his spot near the back door, his body coiled like a spring. Dan moved first, stepping toward the window, pushing the curtain back just enough to see. "They're here," he murmured. Emma rose from her chair, her heart beating slow and steady, her movements controlled. She walked to the window beside him, peering out. 2 CVs this time. One stopped near the gate, blocking the exit. The other continued forward, rolling up the driveway, its headlights slicing through the darkness like knives. It stopped just short of the house. For a long moment, nothing happened. No one got out. No one spoke. Then the driver's side door opened, and a familiar figure emerged. Andrew. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit as he stepped forward, illuminated by the glow of the headlights, his expression calm, composed, as if this were just another business meeting. The back door of the SUV opened next, and a second man stepped out. Not Holt. Someone else. Taller, broader, dressed in dark clothing that made him look like a shadow given form. A man who wasn't here to negotiate. Emma already knew what was coming. Andrew lifted a hand in a gesture that was almost polite. "Miss King," he called. "I was hoping we wouldn't have to do this the hard way." Emma tightened her grip on the shotgun, but she didn't raise it. "Not yet." "Then you should have made a better offer," Andrew sighed, shaking his head. "You misunderstand. This isn't an offer anymore." The man beside him shifted, his stance subtly changing, a telltale sign of someone readying themselves for violence. Dan's voice was low, steady. We take the first shot, or we wait. Emma didn't blink. We wait. Andrew took another step forward. You're outnumbered, Emma. Outmaneuvered. Even if you fight, you don't win this. Emma finally raised the shotgun, leveling it at his chest. That's funny. I was about to say the same thing. For the first time, Andrew hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but she saw it, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his weight shifted back, just slightly. He hadn't expected her to hold her ground like this. Then, without warning, the second man moved. Fast. A flicker of motion as he reached into his jacket. Emma didn't hesitate. She fired. The shotgun blast tore through the air, a thunderous explosion of sound that sent the man stumbling back, clutching his shoulder where the shot had grazed him. Before he could recover, Dan was already firing, his pistol cracking through the night, forcing them to take cover behind the SUV. Everything exploded into chaos. Emma dropped back behind the porch railing as gunfire erupted, bullets slamming into the wood, splinters flying into the air. Baron was barking, a deep, furious sound that echoed through the night as he crouched beside her. Dan returned fire, moving fast, precise, forcing them to stay pinned behind the vehicle. Emma's mind was clear, her breathing steady. She reloaded in seconds, years of muscle memory kicking in, and then she moved. She fired again, aiming for the SUV's front tire, the shot bursting through rubber and metal, sending the vehicle tilting slightly as it sagged onto its axle. Andrew cursed from behind the car. "You're making this worse than it needs to be." Emma, she laughed, sharp and humorless. "You already burned down my barn. What's worse than that?" There was a pause. Then, Holt is on his way. Emma felt her stomach tighten. Dan glanced at her. "We can't hold out against more of them." She knew he was right. They were holding their own for now, but once reinforcements arrived, it would be over. They needed to end this before that happened. She glanced toward the truck behind the shed, then back at Dan. "Cover me." He didn't argue. She moved fast, low to the ground, sprinting through the shadows as Dan laid down cover fire. She reached the truck, yanked open the door, and slid inside. The keys were already in the ignition. Dan had planned for this. She floored it. The truck roared to life, tires spinning against dirt as she tore forward, aiming straight for the SUV blocking the driveway. The men behind it barely had time to react before she slammed into the vehicle, metal crumpling, glass shattering as the force of impact shoved it sideways, clearing the path. Dan was already running toward her, firing one last shot before jumping into the passenger seat. Go, she didn't need to be told twice. The truck lurched forward, tearing down the road, leaving Andrew and his men behind in the dust. As they sped away, Dan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Jesus Christ. Emma didn't take her eyes off the road. "They're not stopping." Dan nodded. "No, but neither are we." And as the headlights cut through the darkness ahead, she knew he was right. This wasn't over. Not yet. Emma didn't slow down until the house was miles behind her, the winding back road cutting through the dense tree line, the truck's tires skidding slightly over loose gravel as she pushed the speedometer past safe limits. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. The cabin smelled like smoke, sweat, and gunpowder, a heavy reminder of just how close they had come to losing everything. Beside her, Dan sat tense and silent, his pistol still gripped in his hand, his breathing shallow and measured. They had made it out. But they weren't safe. Emma's mind raced through every possible next step, weighing her options against the inevitable response that Holt and his men would throw at them. They had crossed a line tonight, had turned what had once been a silent battle of intimidation into outright war. There was no coming back from this. She could see it in Dan's expression, in the way he kept glancing at the rearview mirror, waiting for headlights to appear, for the sound of roaring engines to break through the night. But the road behind them remained empty, for now. "Where are we going?" Dan finally asked, his voice hoarse from smoke and tension. Emma forced herself to focus, her thoughts snapping into place like puzzle pieces. "We need leverage, something to force their hand before they regroup." Dan let out a humorless chuckle, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Leverage? Emma, we just shot up their people and took off like outlaws. I don't think we're in a negotiating position anymore. She shook her head. No, they wouldn't have risked all of this unless they were hiding something bigger, something that's worth more than my land. We find out what it is, and we turn the tables before they have a chance to shut us down. Dan exhaled through his nose, staring ahead at the darkened road. And how exactly do we do that? Emma didn't answer immediately. She took a sharp turn onto an unmarked path, the truck bouncing over uneven ground as she drove toward an old service road that led to the abandoned part of the property, the land that had supposedly been signed over to the state decades ago. She had spent most of her life believing it was just dense forest, untouched and unimportant. But now she wasn't so sure. Something about the missing records, the way Holt had pushed so aggressively, the way Andrew had spoken with such certainty, it all pointed to this place. Dan caught on immediately. You think whatever they're after is out here? Emma nodded. If it wasn't, they wouldn't be this desperate. They drove in silence, the headlights cutting through thick layers of fog as they approached the old section of the property. The road was barely visible beneath years of overgrowth, but Emma knew where she was going. Her father had brought her here once when she was a child, had told her never to come here alone. She had thought it was just an old man's superstition, but now as the trees pressed in around them and the wind carried an eerie stillness, she realized he had been trying to protect her from something he never fully explained. The truck rumbled to a stop in a clearing, the remains of an old structure barely visible through the underbrush. Emma killed the engine and stepped out, shotgun in hand, her breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. Dan followed, his expression guarded as he scanned the area. What exactly are we looking for? He asked. Emma moved toward the crumbling foundation of what had once been a stone building, the walls barely more than rubble now, overtaken by vines and decay. Anything that tells us why they want this land so badly. Dan sighed but didn't argue. He walked the perimeter while Emma crouched near what looked like an entrance to a collapsed basement, running her fingers over the worn edges of the stone. There was something strange about the way the ground felt beneath her boots, hollow. She grabbed a nearby branch and jammed it against the dirt-covered floor. The ground gave way slightly, the wood sinking deeper than it should have. Dan heard it too. That's not normal. Emma dropped to her knees, brushing away layers of dried leaves and loose soil until she felt something solid beneath her hands. Wood. Old and splintered, but man-made. She exchanged a look with Dan before digging her fingers into the cracks, prying until a section of the ground lifted. Beneath it was a trapdoor. A pulse of cold dread ran down her spine. Tell me that's just some old storage cellar, Dan muttered, but his tone was laced with unease. Emma reached for the rusted handle, hesitating for only a moment before yanking it open. The hinges groaned in protest, and a rush of stale, ice-cold air spilled from the darkness below. She shined her flashlight down, revealing a staircase carved from stone, descending into the earth. Dan let out a low curse. Okay, that's not normal, Emma swallowed, forcing herself to breathe evenly. This is what they've been trying to hide. Dan ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. Emma, we don't know what the hell is down there. She met his gaze, her grip tightening on the shotgun. That's exactly why we need to find out. They descended carefully, the air growing colder with each step, the scent of damp earth and something ancient settling in their lungs. The tunnel stretched deeper than she had expected, the walls lined with old wooden beams, some rotted through, others still holding strong despite the weight of time. Then they reached it. A door. Not old and crumbling like the rest of the structure. New. Reinforced steel. Dan exhaled sharply. Son of a bitch, Emma ran her fingers over the cool metal, her pulse pounding. This wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't the work of her family, or the people who had settled this land centuries ago. This was modern. This was deliberate. And this was why Holt had been willing to burn her out. Dan took a step back. Whatever's behind that door, I don't think we're the first ones to come looking for it. Emma stared at the lock, at the security keypad that had no business existing beneath what was supposed to be protected land. The truth settled heavily in her chest. Her family had never just owned a farm. They had been sitting on something much bigger. Dan's voice was tight. We need to go. Now. Emma didn't argue. They turned back, climbing the stairs two at a time, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. They barely made it outside before the sound of distant engines echoed through the forest. Dan's eyes darkened. They know Emma gritted her teeth, gripping the shotgun. Then we don't run. Dan stared at her. Emma, she cut him off. We end this. Tonight, and as the headlights cut through the trees, she knew there was no turning back. Not anymore.